It was a quiet Friday evening in Savannah, Georgia, the kind where the streets glowed under soft amber streetlights and folks took their time walking home. At the edge of historic downtown, tucked between an old bookshop and a faded antique store, stood the Lantern Grill, a cozy little diner that had seen generations of families come and go. The kind of place where the booths were worn just right, and the air always smelled of buttered toast and warm pecan pie. On weekend nights, the diner had a small tradition: gentle live music or child-friendly entertainment, just enough to keep kids smiling while parents finished their meals in peace. That's where Maggie Rivers, a 33-year-old waitress with soft curls and sneakers a little too worn out, worked the dinner shift. She wasn't just another server. Maggie had a little magic in her, literally. Years ago, she had taught elementary school children and used to perform simple magic tricks to calm anxious students. After losing that job and budget cuts, life had steered her toward the food industry. But she never stopped carrying a few tricks in her apron pocket, just in case a kid needed to smile, she'd always say with a shrug and a wink. On that particular evening, Maggie was assigned to the back corner booth, where a tall, silver-haired man in a navy wool coat had just settled in with a small boy at his side. The man was Colin Bennett, 61, a media mogul and billionaire most locals wouldn't recognize unless they followed national business news. He wasn't dressed to impress, nor did he seem interested in making conversation. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from grief. Ever since his wife passed away 2 years ago, Colin had kept mostly to himself, except when it came to his son. Eli Bennett was 7. He clutched a small stuffed rabbit tightly in both arms, his head lowered, his eyes fixed on the ketchup bottle like it might suddenly vanish. After a mild brain injury from an accident, Eli had stopped talking. He rarely looked at people, especially strangers, and loud noises or bright lights made him flinch. He hadn't spoken a word in over a year. Maggie noticed immediately. She didn't say much, didn't force a smile, just placed their menus gently on the table and asked Colin if he wanted coffee. A few minutes later, after quietly bringing out their order, she knelt beside the boy and whispered, "Want to see something neat?" From her apron, she pulled out a silver coin and let it dance across her fingers before making it vanish behind Eli's ear. Then, with a dramatic pause, she pulled out a piece of wrapped chocolate from the same spot and placed it in front of him. Eli blinked. For a moment, the stuffed bunny lowered an inch. Then, his lips curled. Just slightly. Maggie's smile widened. "You're good at spotting magic," she whispered, then twirled a napkin into a rose shape and handed it to him like it was made of gold. Colin, pretending to read the menu, slowly looked up. His eyes were glassy. He hadn't seen that smile in over 12 months. He wasn't sure what just happened. But somehow, in the dim warmth of the Lantern Grill, something inside his son had flickered, like the tiniest spark trying to light again. As the evening wore on and the last rays of sun melted into twilight, Maggie Rivers returned to the corner booth with the check in hand. The little boy still hadn't touched his grilled cheese. He sat motionless, hugging his plush rabbit like a life preserver, eyes cast down and avoiding hers. His father, Colin, quietly sipped his black coffee, glancing occasionally but saying little. It wasn't the first time Maggie had served a family carrying invisible weight, but something about this pair felt heavier than most. She hesitated for a breath, then smiled softly. "Before I go," she said gently, crouching beside the table, "can I show you one more thing?" From her apron pocket, she pulled out a silver coin and held it up to Eli's line of sight. She let it twirl between her fingers, shimmer under the overhead light. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she made it disappear behind his ear, only to replace it magically with a small foil-wrapped chocolate. Eli looked up, startled. And then, he smiled. Just a small hesitant curve of the lips. But unmistakable. Maggie didn't rush it. She simply reached for a napkin and began folding it slowly, her fingers working like quiet poetry. In a few moments, she shaped it into a tiny swan and placed it gently on his plate. Eli clapped once. Then again, soft, timid applause, like a secret he hadn't shared in a long time. Colin never looked up from his menu. But beneath the edge, his hands were trembling. His eyes, hidden behind the paper, glistened with tears he didn't dare let fall. Something had just shifted. And he knew it. The next morning, just as the morning rush began trickling into the Lantern Grill, Maggie was wiping down the counter when a tall man in a black suit stepped through the door. He wasn't the usual kind of customer. His polished shoes didn't match the scuffed linoleum, and the way he scanned the room made every other noise fall away. In his hand was a small envelope. "Miss Rivers?" he asked politely. Maggie blinked. "That's me." He handed her the envelope without a word. Tucked inside was a simple folded card, no logo, no signature, just one line written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "I don't need magic. But my son needs a reason to smile." There was no return address, but Maggie didn't need one. She already knew. Friday came, and though she had initially thought it might be some kind of misunderstanding, a black car was parked outside the diner by 4 p.m., the same driver waiting patiently. The back door swung open, and Maggie was ushered into a world she'd never stepped into: long hallways lined with oil paintings, polished floors that gleamed like glass, and silence so heavy it echoed in her ears. Colin Bennett's home wasn't just big, it was empty. Not in furniture or wealth, but in spirit. It felt like a house that once held laughter and music, now suspended in stillness. Eli was already waiting in the sitting room. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, a deck of oversized playing cards spread in front of him. His stuffed rabbit was tucked under one arm. Maggie smiled, and without ceremony, dropped to the floor beside him. She pulled out a small red scarf from her sleeve, gave it a dramatic twirl, and made it disappear into her closed fist. Eli watched, transfixed. When the scarf reappeared from behind his elbow, he looked at her, not down, not away, but directly at her face. That became their new Friday routine. Maggie didn't come dressed as a performer, and she didn't bring a show. She came as herself, sitting on the floor, telling stories with her hands, letting the simplest tricks become bridges. Eli never spoke, but every week he prepared something. A marble he wanted to make vanish, a card he wanted to force on her, a scarf tucked in his sleeve in mimicry. Colin watched from a distance. Always near, but never interrupting. Sometimes from behind the doorway, sometimes from the grand piano bench. And every time he saw Eli lift his eyes, or offer Maggie a prop, or on rare occasions, laugh silently with his whole face, something in Colin softened. What started as a quiet exchange between waitress and child soon became something more sacred, a ritual of connection, of trust, of something healing. Maggie wasn't trying to fix Eli. She wasn't measuring progress or tracking milestones. She was simply giving him space to enjoy something again. By the third week, Maggie noticed a small change. Eli had laid out 2 coins instead of 1. He wanted her to try his trick. That night, as the driver pulled away from the mansion, Maggie stared out at the winding driveway and whispered to herself, "He doesn't need a teacher. He just needed someone to play with him." And in a house full of silence, Friday evenings began to carry the faint sound of joy returning, one soft smile at a time. By the 4th week, Maggie arrived with a new trick up her sleeve, an old magician's ring that seemed to float between her fingers. But before she could begin, Eli held out his hand. Resting in his small palm was a single playing card, worn at the edges, and a glass marble that shimmered faintly under the chandelier light. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, then at the objects in his hand, then back again, as if daring her to guess what trick he had in store. Maggie froze for a second, then smiled. She recognized the glint in his eyes, not just curiosity, but invitation. He wasn't waiting for entertainment this time. He was offering it. In his own way, Eli had prepared something for her. She leaned in, lowered her voice like a co-conspirator, and said, "All right, mister. Let's see what you've got." He slowly placed the card face down on the rug, then rolled the marble across it with both hands, mimicking one of Maggie's earlier illusions. When nothing happened, he shrugged, then giggled silently, as if that had been the joke all along. Maggie laughed too, not because of the trick, but because she suddenly understood. He didn't need a therapist. He didn't need someone to measure his recovery. He needed a partner. A co-magician. Someone who would sit on the floor, forget about the world, and just play. And that realization, quiet and simple, brought more light into that room than any illusion ever could. Every Friday afternoon, just as the sunlight began to stretch long across the marble floors of the Bennett estate, Maggie arrived with a small canvas bag of surprises. It wasn't fancy, nothing sleek or professional, just a collection of well-loved props that carried years of charm and the smell of childhood curiosity. That week, it was a plastic egg. She rolled it between her fingers, pretending to fumble, then made it vanish behind her back with a dramatic gasp. Eli's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, studying her every movement like a seasoned illusionist in training. When she revealed the egg tucked behind his stuffed rabbit's ear, he blinked in delight, then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small toy dinosaur. He placed it carefully on the rug between them. No words, just a quiet gesture that said, "Your turn to be amazed." The week after that, Maggie came armed with a string, ordinary, except for its extraordinary length. She began tugging it from her sleeve, foot by foot, as if unraveling a thread from a hidden world. Eli stared, transfixed, and when the string just kept coming, he slapped his tiny palms together in silent applause. Then, without hesitation, he crawled over to the toy chest and retrieved an old shoelace, coiling it around his wrist with a sly grin. The routine became their rhythm. Maggie wasn't performing anymore. She was inviting. And Eli, though he never said a word, always answered. After each trick, he'd bring something of his own, a paperclip, a crayon, a single cookie broken in half, offering it like a token of friendship. Sometimes he mimicked her moves. Other times, he created his own little versions of her illusions, like hiding a ball under a napkin and pretending it had vanished. To most, these objects might have seemed meaningless. But to Maggie, they were everything. They were his voice. His connection. His way of saying, "I'm here with you. I see you." Each week she introduced something new, a small empty box that suddenly produced a tissue flower when tapped twice, a scarf that changed color with a flick of the wrist, a toy coin that vanished and reappeared in Eli's sock. And each week he responded, not with words, but with laughter, focus, and the kind of attention she'd only ever seen in the best classrooms she'd taught in long ago. What no one else saw, no therapist, no doctor, was the bond forming between them. It wasn't built on milestones or structured progress. It was built on play, on joy, on tiny acts of wonder that gave a little boy the courage to reach out, to share, to imagine again. Maggie never brought flash or fame. She brought presence. And Eli? He brought hope. Wrapped in silence, expressed through magic. It wasn't a breakthrough you could measure, but it was the kind of transformation you felt, deep in your bones. As the weeks passed and Maggie's visits became a steady rhythm in the Bennett household, the quiet magic unfolding in the sunlit sitting room didn't go unnoticed, especially not by the professionals. Colin had spared no expense when it came to his son's care. The best speech-language pathologists, behavioral therapists, and pediatric specialists were brought in from across the country. Each had their own assessments, charts, and structured approaches. They operated with clipboards in hand, clinical in tone, hopeful in theory. But none had managed to get Eli to make eye contact, let alone engage, until Maggie arrived. At first, they observed from a distance with polite curiosity, assuming Maggie's involvement was just another form of distraction, temporary and superficial. But then came the day when Eli clapped during one of her tricks. The next week, he offered her his own version of a disappearing act. And then, most shocking of all, he began reaching for her hand when she entered the room. That's when the questions began. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, the experts started to express concern, not about Eli's progress, but about the method of it. "Magic tricks are fun, sure," one of the therapists murmured, "but what exactly are they accomplishing in terms of structured speech therapy?" She's not certified, another added. There's no evidence-based model here. This isn't how we measure developmental gains. There were whispers of boundaries, questions about liability, and subtle suggestions to Colin that perhaps Maggie's presence was becoming too influential. But Colin, for all his grief and guarded pride, had eyes. He saw what they couldn't chart on a graph. He saw Eli waiting by the window every Friday afternoon, fingers twitching with excitement, clutching a small object to share. He saw the way his son's body relaxed in Maggie's presence, how the stiffness melted from his shoulders, how his eyes began to linger longer on faces. And most of all, he saw the unmistakable light returning, flickering at first, but growing stronger each week. Maggie, for her part, said nothing about the tension. She had no desire to compete with professionals or prove her worth. She didn't push back. She didn't make claims. She didn't ask for credit. She simply kept showing up, with her bag of old tricks, her warm patience, and her quiet understanding that healing didn't always look like progress on paper. Some weeks, Eli said nothing. Other weeks, he would mimic a trick over and over, like he was trying to perfect it. No matter the pace, Maggie responded with the same calm presence, never forcing, never rushing, just being there. And while others debated the legitimacy of her impact, she was busy folding paper napkins into swans, balancing marbles on the backs of spoons, and teaching a little boy how to smile with his whole face again. Maggie wasn't seeking fame. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was just answering a call, a silent one, spoken not in words, but in the eyes of a child who hadn't smiled in far too long. And to her, that was more than enough. The trouble started with a party. It was a spring afternoon, one of the rare days when the Bennett estate was filled with people again. Colin had agreed reluctantly to host a small charity luncheon, mostly out of obligation. The house buzzed with soft conversation, light jazz from a string quartet, and the polite clinking of crystal glasses. Eli stayed close to the back garden, quiet as always, but calmer than usual with Maggie by his side. She wasn't meant to perform that day. But as the crowd drifted and conversations died down, one of the guests noticed Maggie and Eli seated under the magnolia tree. Eli had just handed her a small plastic ring, one of his newest treasures. In return, Maggie reached gently behind his ear and pulled out a sparkling clip-on earring, presenting it to him like a prize. Eli laughed, a soft, breathy sound that made a few heads turn. Someone nearby was filming. By morning, the video had gone viral. The caption read, "Billionaire believes his son's recovery comes from magic tricks?" It didn't take long for the media to latch on. The story was too good, too unusual, to ignore. A mysterious waitress, an emotionally withdrawn billionaire, and a disabled child brought back to life by parlor tricks? It wrote itself. Colin saw the video before breakfast. His face turned to stone. He didn't read the comments. He didn't have to. The mere suggestion that Maggie had used Eli for attention, that she had orchestrated this quiet miracle for clicks and clout, was enough to ignite a fury in him that hadn't surfaced since his wife died. Within hours, he made a decision. The driver was instructed to cancel all future pickups. The security detail was told to bar Maggie from the property. A certified check was drawn up, 5 figures, and enclosed in a white envelope marked simply, "Thank you. This is for your time. Please respect our privacy." Maggie received the envelope in silence. She didn't open it. She didn't try to call. She didn't defend herself. She simply walked to the back of her small apartment, took down a wooden box from the shelf, the same one she used to carry her first deck of cards when she performed at the school library years ago, and placed something inside, the plastic ring Eli had given her, the clip-on earring from the party, and a folded card with a note that read, "I don't need the stage. Just the space to be kind." Then she returned the envelope unopened, and left the box on the front steps of the Bennett estate, along with one final note. "I'm not disappearing. I'm just waiting to be asked back." She walked away without tears, without anger. But deep in her chest, the The silence hurt more than any accusation could. Because she knew what they had built wasn't fake. She knew Eli's joy was real. And she knew, even if no one else believed it, that sometimes the smallest kindness could spark a transformation bigger than anyone expected. But now, the magic had been broken. And Maggie didn't know if it would ever be allowed to return. Maggie stood quietly at the iron gate of the Bennett estate, the early morning fog curling around her shoes. In her hands, she held a small wooden box. Nothing ornate, just something simple and worn, like it had lived through years of gentle use. Inside it was a deck of oversized playing cards, the kind you'd find in a first-grade classroom, corners frayed from little hands practicing clumsy sleights of hand. They were Eli's favorite. Alongside the cards, she tucked a note, handwritten in blue ink, a little smudged from her thumb. "I'm not disappearing. I'm just waiting to be called back." She placed the box gently on the stone step near the front entrance. No knock. No doorbell. Just the quiet offering of a heart that had nothing to prove, only something to give. The money Colin had sent still sat unopened on her kitchen counter. She hadn't touched it. She didn't need compensation. What she needed was connection. A reason. A purpose. A little boy who reminded her why she kept carrying those tricks in her apron all these years. She turned to leave, her coat pulled tight against the morning chill. Behind her, the mansion stood tall and still, its windows like watching eyes. But she didn't look back. She had left her message. Now all that remained was to wait, not for forgiveness, not for vindication. Just for someone to remember the magic was never hers alone. Colin Bennett wasn't a man who doubted his instincts. In business, he trusted facts, trusted patterns. But something about this didn't sit right. A week had passed since he cut Maggie out of their lives. A week since Eli stopped waiting by the window at 4 p.m., clutching his stuffed rabbit with eyes full of silent hope. The boy had withdrawn again, not in anger, but in absence. The spark that had flickered to life in him was fading, and Colin felt it every time he walked past the quiet sitting room where laughter once danced between card tricks and marbles. He couldn't sleep. One night, unable to shake the weight in his chest, Colin called in his most trusted aide, Malcolm, a man who had handled everything from media leaks to corporate sabotage over the past 20 years. "I need you to find out where that video came from," Colin said, voice low, jaw clenched. "And I need the truth. All of it." Malcolm got to work. What he uncovered took less than 48 hours, but hit harder than any hostile takeover Colin had ever faced. The footage of Maggie and Eli, sweet, harmless, deeply personal, had been recorded by a freelance event coordinator who had worked that charity luncheon. A woman who, it turned out, had submitted a padded invoice with several questionable charges for VIP extras Colin had never approved. Her payment had been rejected. Politely, but firmly. And this, it seemed, was her revenge. She'd leaked the video to a gossip blog known for sensationalizing stories about the ultra-wealthy. The headline had done exactly what she intended: humiliate Colin, question his parenting, and make a spectacle of his most private struggle. Maggie? She'd had no idea. She hadn't posted it. Hadn't even known it was being filmed. There was no Instagram post, no online profile being boosted, no interviews given. She'd gone home that night the same way she always did, quietly, without fanfare. Malcolm handed Colin the printed report and waited for a response. But Colin said nothing. He just stared at the last page, the photo of the wooden box Maggie had left on their doorstep. Inside it, the worn deck of cards. Her note. "I'm not disappearing. I'm just waiting to be called back." A silence stretched across the room like a heavy curtain. For the first time in months, Colin felt something sharper than pride. It was shame. He had assumed the worst of a woman who had only ever shown his son kindness. He had believed the noise over what he'd witnessed with his own eyes, the joy, the laughter, the subtle return of something he thought had been lost forever. Without another word, Colin stood, walked to the sitting room, and found Eli on the carpet, alone, spinning a coin across the hardwood floor. It wobbled, tipped, and fell with a hollow clink. Eli picked it up again, held it tight, and whispered barely above a breath, "Without Miss Maggie, the coin doesn't fly." Colin froze. That was Eli's first full sentence in over a year. Tears pooled behind his eyes, but he let them fall this time. He had been wrong. And now, he knew what he had to do. The house was unusually still that morning. No clinking of silverware, no soft hum of classical music playing from the built-in speakers. Just the distant sound of a clock ticking in the hallway and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. Colin Bennett moved slowly through the corridor, unsure of what he expected to find. It had been weeks since he'd last heard laughter echo in this space. Weeks since the Friday afternoons when the sitting room came alive with scarves, paper flowers, and a kind of joy he thought he'd never witness again. Now, the silence felt heavier than grief. He stopped outside Eli's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Peering in, Colin saw his son sitting cross-legged on the floor. No toys, no tablet, no distractions. Just a single silver coin balanced on the wood between his palms. Eli spun it once. It twirled a moment, then tipped, clinking softly before rolling to a stop. Eli picked it up again. His small hands cupped it carefully, like it was fragile, sacred. He stared at it as if trying to will it to fly. Colin stepped forward, quiet, almost afraid to break the moment. And then he heard it. A whisper. Barely audible. A voice unused for over a year, soft and husky from silence. "Without Miss Maggie." The boy paused. Looked down at the coin. "The coin doesn't fly." Colin's breath caught in his throat. For a full second, time stood still. He hadn't imagined it. He knew he hadn't. His son, his sweet, quiet Eli, had just spoken. Not just a word. A sentence. A thought. A memory wrapped in meaning. The coin slipped from Eli's fingers again, bouncing once before settling. But this time, the child didn't reach for it. He looked up instead. Right at his father. Colin sank to his knees, the hardwood pressing against his joints, his arms trembling as he tried to steady himself. His throat burned, and when he finally spoke, it came out broken. "Eli," he whispered, barely able to say his name. But Eli didn't flinch. Instead, he picked up the coin and held it out. "Can we make it fly again?" he asked. Colin couldn't stop the tears. They came fast, hot, falling onto his shirt collar and soaking the cuffs of his sleeves. For months, he had searched for answers, hired experts, begged the world to bring his son back to him. And all along, the answer hadn't come from therapy rooms or cutting-edge research. It had come from a woman with a napkin, a coin, and a heart full of patience. He reached out, pulled his son into his arms, and held him tight, not like a fragile thing, but like something sacred rediscovered. "Yes, son," he said through tears. "Yes, we'll make it fly again." And in that moment, the silence that had haunted the Bennett estate finally broke, not with noise, but with love. And it sounded like hope. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Colin Bennett stepped into the Lantern Grill. He looked nothing like the man people expected when they read his name in Forbes or watched interviews about media empires and investment portfolios. Gone were the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the sleek black town car waiting outside. Today he wore jeans, a navy sweater, and shoes that looked like they'd walked through more than one regret. No entourage. No security. Just a father. The waitress behind the counter glanced up surprised. But before she could speak, Colin raised a hand gently. His eyes scanned the room until he saw the familiar booth tucked into the back corner. The same one where it had all started. He walked over slowly, then slid into the seat, resting his hands on the table like a man settling into something sacred. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small silver coin and placed it in the center of the table. When Maggie Rivers emerged from the kitchen with a tray in hand, her steps faltered. Their eyes met. She didn't rush over. didn't ask questions. She just walked, steady, quiet, and stood beside the booth, wiping her hands on her apron. Colin looked up at her, his voice soft but sure. "I never believed in magic," he said. "But then it made my son speak again." Maggie didn't say a word. She just sat down across from him, folding her hands gently in her lap. Colin reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. Inside was a proposal, handwritten notes, outlines, and a name printed in clean lettering across the top: Magic Connect. A new project. A new hope. "We're building something," Colin explained. "A program for children like Eli. Not a clinic. Not another system. Just a place where wonder gets to live again." He looked at her, voice thick with humility. "And I can't do it without you." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she smiled, soft and steady, the same way she had when Eli first reached for her hand instead of turning away. "I'm in," she whispered. "But only if we let the kids teach us too." Colin chuckled, the first real laugh he'd allowed himself in months. That very week, Maggie returned to the Bennett estate, this time not as a guest, not as a performer, but as a partner. A co-founder. A quiet force in a brand new movement where card tricks met compassion, and healing began not with structure, but with surprise. In a bright new room filled with scarves, paper flowers, and boxes of crayons, Magic Connect was born. It wasn't a place to fix children. It was a place where they were free to explore, to play, to connect. And in the center of it all, Eli stood proudly beside Maggie, holding up a deck of cards with a grin that stretched all the way to his eyes. The coin had flown. And now, so would countless other hearts. The auditorium was filled with quiet anticipation. Parents, educators, and therapists from across the state had gathered for the inaugural Magic Connect conference, a program that, just months ago, hadn't even existed. Now it had a name, a mission, and a waiting list filled with families searching for a different kind of hope. At the center of the stage stood Maggie Rivers, holding a simple deck of oversized playing cards. She wasn't in costume, wasn't performing. She was just being Maggie, patient, grounded, gentle. She spoke for a moment about the power of play, about trust, about how sometimes the smallest gestures could build bridges no therapist's chart could measure. Then she turned slightly, smiled, and held out a single card. From the side curtain, Eli stepped into the spotlight. He wore a navy vest and a shy smile, his stuffed rabbit peeking out from his backpack. His feet moved slowly but with purpose, his eyes locked on Maggie's. When he reached her, he took the card from her hand and turned to face the audience. He held it high. "This," he said clearly, his voice calm and sure, "is the ace." He paused, looking down at the card, then back up. "A is for intoned safe." He turned to Maggie, his smile widening. "With Miss Maggie, I'm always safe." The room fell silent. Not from discomfort, but from awe. Tears rolled freely. Not just from Colin, who stood backstage clutching a handkerchief, but from dozens of parents who, for the first time in a long time, felt seen. In that moment, no one needed scientific data or a PowerPoint presentation. Because a little boy who once refused to speak had just delivered the most powerful testimony of all. And as Maggie gently took his hand, the final words of the evening echoed through the auditorium. "Not all magic is illusion. Sometimes the simplest tricks are enough to awaken a silent heart." If you believe that gentleness holds a kind of magic all its own, please give this video a like. And if you'd love to hear more heartwarming stories like this, stories of healing, hope, and quiet miracles, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you next time.